Everyone. Good afternoon to those. I think it's just turned afternoon. For those that are joining in the Gulf, welcome to Resilient Businesses from Fragmentation to Orchestration. I'm Simon Whitburn, VP of Growth here at SustainGRC, and really excited to have everybody on the call. We've got a really good numbers. So obviously this is a subject that is a lot of interest. We've got people joining from all over EMEA, Africa, Middle East, etc. So real cross section. So just a couple of housekeeping items before we get going. You're all muted, obviously it's through LinkedIn, so it keeps the audio nice and clean. Just so you know that we are recording this, recording the full session, so that will go out to everyone who's registered. So if any colleagues missed the registration window and would like to look at the discussion, then you can obviously forward that on to them. Okay, so what are we going to be discussing in the next hour? We're going to be spending the session on the central problem. Why audit, risk, business continuity management so often operate in separate worlds inside the same organisation, even when organisations have invested heavily in all three. We're going to hear from the panel, real organisations, real decisions, what works, what doesn't work. And Dr. Ahmed will be asking the important questions and moderating the session. I'll be keeping us honest as far as time is concerned, so we'll be finishing as close to 11 o'clock British Standard Summertime. Right, on to some introductions. So these are the people who are actually going to make this worth your hour. Firstly, Dr. Ahmed Shawky is the CEO and founder of SustainGRC. A former Chief Audit Executive and current Board and Audit Committee member, he's going to set the strategic frame why this problem exists and why it matters at board level. We have Salih Ahmed, is Head of Internal Audit at Flormar in Istanbul, and someone who's spent over a decade managing internal audit across more than 60 countries. So when Salih talks about what integrated governance looks like at scale, he really means it. Then we have Bushra AlWazzan, is Group Chief Internal Auditor at Boubyan Bank here over in Kuwait. And what makes Bushra's perspective generally sort of rare is that she owns both internal audit functions and BCM and disaster recovery. That combined in a regulated bank is kind of unusual. So I'm really looking forward to her perspective on the discussion. Then we have Imran is Director of Internal Audit at AD Ports in Abu Dhabi, award-winning risk and audit leader with a track record across more than 50 countries. Critical infrastructure at scale, has a different relationship with resilience than most organisations, and I think that will come through in the conversation. And finally, we have Aarti Bangera, is most recently Risk and Compliance Director at Mastercard in the Nordics. Aarti has deep expertise on EU regulations, DORA, NIS2 specifically, and a BCM compliance faculty member. She's the person in the room who can tell you what regulations really look like and not what just the text says. So we have four amazing practitioners, all of them doing the work right now inside real organisations. So let's get into it. So with that, I'm going to hand over to you, Dr. Ahmed.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Simon, and welcome everyone. And a very warm welcome to our panelists, who between them carry a very rich experience across sectors and geographies. I wouldn't tell you that their combined experience is over 100 years, so you can't guess their age. But before we dive in, let me set the scene with a brief overview of the reality and how AI is changing the landscape of risk and assurance. Most organizations still run internal audit, risk, enterprise risk management, business continuity, information security, and corporate governance as 5 separate functions, separate teams, 5 tool sets, separate tools and systems, and more important, and often 5 versions of the truth. So leaders in each function have been rewarded for owning their silo. I think I was one of them, not for sharing across it. And that structure and approach was always questionable. But in 2026, in the age of AI, it's becoming indefensible. Let me give you 3 facts. First, AI is being deployed at a hyperspeed, at Ferrari speed, while a lot of organizations are still running on bicycle brakes. Remember that. Nearly 9 in 10 organizations now use AI, while only 1 or 2 can actually govern their use of AI. The second, the shocks, disruptions, no longer arrive politely one at a time. Geopolitical instability is cascading through supply chains and ways the BCM plans never mapped. While regulators across the Gulf, Europe, and beyond move at the same time, asking questions no single function can answer alone. It needs a unified source of truth. The third fact, those same 5 functions burn considerable time and efforts chasing the same data separately. A fact many are sweeping under the rug, hiding behind the independence walls. Priority risks are shifting. And in 2026, the number 1 risk isn't cyber or regulatory changes. Might be surprising to many here. The information integrity, where the data behind a decision can actually be trusted, is the number 1, is the priority risk now. So the answer isn't another framework, isn't another committee, it's orchestration. A mindset shift, and an architectural change, enabling infrastructure where audit, risk, continuity, security, and governance share data, share signals, and operate as one system rather than 5. To be clear, orchestration isn't consolidation. You don't merge the function. You don't compromise independence or separation of duties. You operate on the right infrastructure, the right access permission. So the data is single-sourced and trusted, while the judgment, the oversight, the accountability remain entirely separate. Because independence is about judgment, not data. So AI is now changing the equation. Agentic AI can now service signals across all the 5 functions simultaneously, flagging what each needs to act on with precision in real time. The technology to orchestrate already exists. So what is harder is the mindset shift, convincing 5 functions that sharing data doesn't mean giving away independence and objectivity. So on this panel, enough of me, we have practitioners who lived these challenges and observed them across sectors and regions. They will tell us what needs to change, what 2026 is accelerating, and what good actually looks like. Let's get into it. My first question is to the whole panel in a round robin, starting with Bushra, then Salih, then Imran, and Aarti. So, my first question. For where each of you sits, how integrated are the risk and assurance functions today, really? And in the era of AI, how integrated do they need to be? So don't forget now your sequence. Bushra, can you please get us started?
Yes, good morning or good afternoon to everyone around here. And thank you, Simon, for the introductory. Thank you, Dr. Ahmed, for the beautiful information you've shared with us. Now, you mentioned a very important word here. I'll just pick very quickly on what you've just illustrated. You've said a very 2 or 3 words that really touches me every time I do BCM auditing or we work on BCM. One of them is BCM never maps. And this is exactly what happens today. Today, operational reality, what we see on ground, it always means that we have duplicated data requests. We see disjoint risk maps, and we see a lot of misalignment between second and third line of defense. Everyone wants to give their opinion on that, and this is where we see the duplications happen and the misalignment happens. Today or currently, the integration leans more towards compliance more than true operational alignment. So this is exactly what the current state is. And I've seen that not happen in just one bank. Today, I do work for Boubyan Bank. However, I've been working and shifting from different banks across Kuwait in local. And I've seen also, I've worked with government sector. I've worked with some international or regional banks as well. Now, the first line of defense owns the day-to-day risks, while the second line, they see those or oversee those controls. When it comes for us in the third line of defense, we provide the independent assurance of whether these are actually functional or not. However, the cooperation between all of those line of defense, unfortunately, occasionally happens. And this is where we fall in between the gaps. The actual thing, or the AI era, what needs to be mandated moving forward is we will need to see more active risk landscapes. We will need to see unified data environments. And we will need to see more regulatory pressure. And this is exactly what we're seeing here from the regulators. They're pushing toward this AI pressure. They're giving us more validation on what the AI models need to look like, and they're shaping the frameworks on those regulations and those requirements. So I don't want to take time from my colleagues over here, but I'm just trying to put very quick spots.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bushra. Salih?
Yep. Yeah, I agree. All the things Bushra said. I want to add some things. I think risk and assurance functions are more connected today than they were 10 years ago, maybe. But honestly, in many countries, in many companies, they still work like distant cousins. They know each other, but they don't really talk enough, you know? Sometimes risk management creates beautiful risk registers. Risk management does that. Internal audit creates powerful audit reports. And everybody says we are fully aligned for the risk scenario. But when the real crisis happened, suddenly people discover they were looking at the same problem, but from a completely different angles. Risks now change weekly, sometimes daily. So if risk, audit, compliance, and operations work separately, companies will always react too late. In the past, we were auditing something once or twice a year. Now things changed. Now companies need continuous auditing. That means risk and assurance functions must become much more integrated. Not only sharing reports, but sharing signals, data, concerns, and business understanding in real time. And AI can become a common language between risk and assurance functions. So instead of every department looking at separate Excel files, reports, or dashboards, AI can connect data from internal audit, risk management, compliance, operations in one place and identify patterns for much faster, yeah, and not like before. So it can help teams see early warning signals, unusual transactions, control failures that we always like to see them before, the emerging risks before they become major problems. So in a way, AI can reduce the classic situation where one department says, we saw the problem, and the other one says, nobody told us. So at the end of the day, AI is not only a technological discussion. It is also a governance, risk, and communication discussion. So companies that connect the risk and assurance functions will probably react faster, see problems earlier, and build stronger resilience in the future. So that's my opinion about this.
Thank you. Thanks, Salih. And thanks for the analogy. I love the analogy about, about the cousins.
Exactly.
So it's definitely, it's a capability. The capability is there. It is a connection gap. So thank you so much. Next is Imran.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone from wherever you are joining. Emma, thank you for the introduction. And I really like what you said about that AI is moving and cruising with a Ferrari speed. And I would say on top of that, that I think the governance is going ahead with the speed of the snail. So it's always the catch-up game that governance plays. And I think Saleh has also highlighted great points. So to your question, how integrated and risk and assurance functions today, I would say most organizations are more integrated on paper than they are on practice. So, in a typical scenario that I see in many organizations, they share a slide deck at the audit committee and they call it alignment. So the typical picture, risk assessment still producing risk registers, internal audit testing against it, and compliance doing its own thing in a separate lane. So everyone's busy, but I believe no one is really talking. So when you look at how the decisions are made, they're still in silos. So when you see the business owners and the key stakeholders are making decisions, we hardly see risk functions sitting in that room. Sometimes, risk function is still isolated, does its own list management, present a list of risks that has nothing to do with business strategy or the decision making that the business is doing on a day-to-day basis. When it comes to AI, I think this in the AI era, this model, it doesn't just underperform, it fails because AI doesn't wait for your annual risk assessment. It is deployed on a Tuesday, creates an exposure on a Thursday. And if audited risk functions, are connecting and think, sorry. And if audited risk functions are syncing up quarterly, you're already too late, And I think what business leaders need is a shared view of what could impact their strategic objectives and a common understanding of what actions are required. So it's a bit of reframing as well. Instead of talking about what could go wrong, we also need to talk about what needs to go right. We need to bring the strategic objectives into picture rather than bringing that risk discussion. And that's where the risk functions become more relevant. And that's where the integration, within the decision-making process gets better.
Thank you, Imran. I will come just after this round. I'll come to the objective-focused approach and looking at what should go right, not only what went wrong or what goes wrong. So thank you so much for sharing that. Aarti, if you could share your perspective, please. You are mute, Aarti.
Sorry. I wanted to say thanks for the great introduction, and good morning, afternoon, evening to everybody. I can only agree with what has been said so far. I think I like the comment on the strategic goals because risk starts with understanding we have a common strategy. All the functions we need to live up, we have to support to our common strategy. And what most companies have tendency to do is work in silos. I think risk management has a very, very important role because I always say that the risk function job is to connect the dots. And that's what we are talking. We have a lot of fragmented information and we are not aligning and providing a common message to the top management. And I think one of the things like I have done as an expert is like trying to prepare always for our risk assessment, trying to understand, do we have any audit findings? Do we have any incidents on these areas? Do we have any business continuity plans in place? So understanding all the rate of outputs, but that's very time consuming every time you need to do a risk assessment. So, and then you need to validate all the outputs that you have received. Do we see any red flag? Because we don't have a risk in this area, but we have 10 incidents in this area. So there is something that is not connecting and working. So how do we make sure that we can do a consistency check and make sure that we can get the right outputs and we can provide a common view to the top management because we need to trigger decision making. So I think that's my take based on all the good input that my colleagues has mentioned already. But AI has a key role, I think, on connecting all the dots and making sure we can do some consistency check on the data outputs we see from all the functions to provide a common view to the management.
Thank you so much. I will definitely dig deeper into the AI and AI governance and again your perspective on that, Aarti, later in the discussion. But for now, we have now, so for perspective, one common thread. The gap isn't capability, it's connection. So now let's dig into where that shows up in practice. So Imran, starting with the objective, starting with you, the objective focused approach. So, before we get into that in detail, so many organizations now you see still managing risk using approaches built for a more stable world. So let's talk about the stability and instability. Where do you see the biggest disconnect between traditional risk management and today's reality? And then we'll come later to the objective-based approach.
Yeah. So let me ask you this question, and maybe to everyone who is attending this event. The question here it is, if the stakeholders, they don't make decision based on colors, why do we represent risk in colors? Have you seen any executive saying, okay, since it's red or amber and green, we're gonna make a certain decision in a certain way? So they don't think in color. So why do we keep representing risk in those colors? Why don't we talk in the language of strategic alignment and decision making? And so what is happening in traditional risk management approach? We measure what happened, categorize it, put it on a heat map, and present it to as a view of where we are today. But the time that picture is assembled, the risks has already shifted. I call it sometimes this photo frame approach, where we debate on the colors, that frame that photo, red, amber, green. This gives us some sense of accomplishment as if we have done that, and then that picture remains static until next quarter or 6 months or sometimes a year. But risk change every year. Risk doesn't change once a year. It's not static, and it doesn't wait for you to update your risk register as well. And it certainly doesn't care about your strategic plan. So what we need is alignment of risk analysis or reporting with the speed of decision making. And I think that's where the biggest gap is. People on the front lines, unaware of that framed picture of red, amber, green, they make decisions every day on a day-to-day basis, and they don't know what sits in that risk register. So there is a big disconnect between the two. The second disconnect is that we are still largely measuring risk in isolation from strategy and decision making. So risk functions will tell you they're aligned to strategic objectives, but in practice, they're just cataloging risk. I sometimes call this list management rather than risk management. So what real effective risk management needs to do is to focus on enabling decisions. Leaders are not asking, what are my top 10 risks? They're asking, where should I invest? What should I stop doing? What will prevent us from achieving our objectives? So if risk management cannot answer those questions, it's not relevant. That's why nobody invites risk management into those key strategic discussion meetings, in the strategy setting meeting, and discussing the key discussion. Risk management in many organizations in a traditional way sits in isolation, presents a list of risks that has nothing to do with the way business is being run. So I feel there is this huge disconnect between the way we manage and report risk, the way we connect them with the business, and the way business is actually run.
Thank you for showing that real disconnect, Imran. To Bushra. Bushra, you have sat on both sides. You have audited DCM, you have owned it. So let us put the harder question to you. Organizations have invested heavily for a decade in risk frameworks, continuity plans, resilience programs, cyber governance. Yet when major disruption hits, many still struggle to respond. From your experience leading both continuity and internal audit, what explains the gap between preparedness on paper and the performance in reality? It's a tough one.
So, yeah, it's a very, very tough question here. But I really like the way how Imran shortened and gave us a very nice name to it, saying list management. And actually, when we see this, the biggest lesson I've learned during my career is that resilience is not built through frameworks, but it is actually built through integration. And this is where we see a lot of management and teams actually confusing compliance with capabilities. And this exactly happens when we see there is no organization that doesn't have a policy and procedure. There is no organization that doesn't have BCM records or a list or a checklist. All of us have those things. But when danger or when actually things happen, we see teams freeze. They don't know what to do. They're stuck in their decisions. The decision maker themselves do not have real-time visibility on what's going on ground. And a lot of that visibility is actually missing because there is an important factor that we really need to highlight on this webinar or this conversation here, is that our dependency on third and fourth parties. We see a lot of dependencies on those stakeholders. They are a major stakeholders when risk happens. We depend a lot on them. But do we have the visibility on what's going on there? Do we have a visibility on their BCM as well? This is where we actually lack information, lack real-time monitoring, lack control and governance. And actually to see those, a lot of the incident playbooks do not interfere or do not mention third or fourth party manuals, or even how do we communicate with those people. And a lot of gaps actually even happen between policy owners and action owners. In reality, I can own the policy. I can put the decisions and I can tell people, don't do this, do that. Don't do it that way. Make sure you do it this way. But do the action owners actually know what the policy sets? Are they aware of it? Have they practiced this policy? Have they went and on ground and tested it? This is where we see the majority of the gaps happen. Now, where does internal audit come into this? There is a trap that internal audit falls into, and I've seen that happen in many organizations. That trap is we ensure that we audit BCM or audit price management or business continuity on documentation. Since I have it on my annual plan, then I'm good. I'm on the safe side, and that is not what should be happening. What we need to do is we need to make sure the effectiveness of the results of that testing. Have we seen the results? Have we tested those results? Are they actually functioning? And last but not least, I'll just go back to the action owners. When we put scenarios on crisis or information or any disaster that is happening, it is very funny to say that every time we change that scenario, the action owners will have a completely different role to play. I'll just keep that aside, and then maybe we'll talk about it later on. And I'll just give some room for my colleagues to speak about their point of view on that.
Thank you, Bushra, for highlighting that the policy ownership is separate from the action ownership. So you name the gap between paper and performance. Perhaps to you, Salih, you have argued that the tools themselves are part of the problem, and that people are managing today's risks with yesterday's tools. Let's make the case. So I'd like to hear from you. When you walk into auditing a BCM program, what's the first sign you pick that the two teams are not actually talking? They are disconnected or fragmented.
First of all, I completely agree with Imran, and I have a similar perspective with Bushra. I would like to mention something very important here. I have been working in internal audit almost 30 years across different sectors in many countries. And honestly, one of the most interesting things I still see today is this. In many companies, business continuity management is still not treated as a fully independent discipline. So, in fact, especially in Turkey or near countries, in many organizations, there is not even a separate BCM department. The topic is usually pushed under IT. So people think BCM means backups, servers, recovery systems, those type of things, you know. So of course, technology is important. Yeah, and I don't ignore those type of things. But a company doesn't stop operating only because of a server fails. Sometimes operations stop because one supplier disappears, like Bushra says, or one port closes, or one experienced employee resigns, or one Excel file suddenly becomes the most critical system in the company. Or usually nobody realizes this, but until that person goes on vacation, you know, with an Excel file on his computer. So coming to your question, what is the first sign internal audit and BCM are not really talking to each other? For me, the answer is usually very simple. BCM talks about scenarios, internal audit talks about controls, but nobody talks enough about operational dependencies. So this is where the gap starts, in my opinion. BCM teams often prepare theoretical recovery plans. Internal audit teams, on the other hand, test governance structures and control mechanisms, like every internal audit does that. But many times, neither side fully analyzes the business truly depends on to continue operating during a crisis. For example, do we depend on one supplier, or do we depend on one country? Do we have alternative logistic routes? Can production continue manually if systems fail? Are there key processes, for example, depending on only one person? So these are very operational questions. So, and honestly, these are the questions that create the biggest surprises during a real crisis. So let me give you a small example for procurement. Internal auditors often review approvals, segregation of duties, purchase orders, or vendor onboarding, those type of things, classical internal controls. But sometimes the more important question is, what happens if this supplier disappears tomorrow morning? So, and very often companies do not have a clear answer to that question. So, because many organizations still see BCM investments as an extra cost. People think, why should we spend money for something that never happened? Or it may never happen, you know. So human nature is optimistic. We like to believe if it didn't happen yesterday, probably it won't happen tomorrow. Unfortunately, the world recently gave us many examples showing this is not true. Regional tensions in the Gulf, for example, everybody knows that, affected logistic routes and transit times. The pandemic, like a couple of years ago, affected global supply chains. Everything collapsed. And in Turkey, we all know earthquakes are not theoretical risks. They are real risks. But despite this reality, in many organizations, BCM plans are still not mature enough. Sometimes data backups exist, but nobody tested them, whether systems can actually recover quickly, like Bushra said. Alternative office locations, for example, they exist on paper, but employees do not even know where they are. Manual fallback procedures exist, but nobody practiced them. So crisis committees also exist, but during a real crisis, people suddenly discover that nobody knows who should make decisions. So this is where internal audit can create huge value, in my opinion, because auditors are naturally trained to ask uncomfortable questions. We are professionally very curious people, and sometimes maybe too curious. That is why the business units become nervous when internal audit enters to the meeting room. So,
Salih, if you allow me, sorry to interrupt,
Sorry.
but you've been talking about the things going on here in the region, and when you're talking, it really jumps into my head saying, what happens? For example, I'll just give a very quick example here. A few days back, the international airport of Kuwait was hit by some missiles. And for some reason, flights were suddenly disrupted. Now, previous to that, we had another disaster happening where the entire flights stopped. I'm comparing two airways happening here in Kuwait. One of them had a disaster plan and had a business continuity, and they shifted all of their operations to another country, to the closest country available, and they had the transportation, land transportation to the people over there. Well, the other company was stuck, and they had to follow the lead. So I'm just saying how business continuity is really
perfect example. Perfect example.
Yes, yeah. So yeah, why you're talking? This came to my head. And sorry again
exactly,
for the
exactly.
interruption.
The problem is, can this really work under pressure? The question is like that. Has it been tested? Does the operation truly understand the plan? Can the company continue operating for 1 week during disruption? No. I saw many companies, it didn't happen. So the decision making is important. So at the end of the day, crises do not test documents. So Ahmed, Dr. Ahmed, I will give I hand it back to you before I turn this webinar to live audit workshop. You know,
it's a great. We see also Imran has some perspective because he's in the infrastructure. He's in the infrastructure sector. So Imran.
No, I'm sorry to keep Aarti waiting, but I'll quickly add on to what Saleh has said. One thing really resonated. He talked about that how we see things in isolation and we don't see interdependencies. That's another typical flaw in a traditional risk management when we see one risk as one line item. So we compartmentalize risk. We say, okay, these are financial risks, these are operational risks, these are health and safety risks. What we don't see is the interdependencies of those risks. When we see, okay, if some health and safety event happens, what would be the implications on operations, and what would be the implications on financial, and what would be some of the reputational impacts of that? So in a traditional way, when we look at risk in isolation, that doesn't give us holistic view of what we need to do, and hence doesn't help us make better decisions, doesn't help us in terms of enhancing the organizational resilience. So that was just my point. I thought I'll add it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Great insights. And now to Aarti. So far we have looked at this from inside the organization. So you have set where the regulators' expectations meet operating reality, and Europe has run the life experiment, DORA. So let's talk about that for a minute. So DORA has been live for over a year. Honestly, we are a very frank conversation here. What's the gap between what organizations really report and what's actually happening underneath? So the performance reality gap, that's what I call. So any insights here you would like to share, Aarti?
Yes, and I would like to mention that based on the comments that were mentioned previously, talking about the dependency on supplier, actually DORA is addressing that fact that if a supplier disappears, what are you doing about it? So I think this regulation covers that part, and it was a very good point made. I think many firms have produced policies, all the mapping, have created all the governance, which is what we do always when we have a new regulation. But we always felt on operationalizing the controls, and I think that's the gap that we have. DORA is forcing a shift from documentation to demonstrate capability, and I think that's the change. And if we look at some of the components on the ICT risk management, so most of the organizations report we have ICT risk framework or policy in place. We have updated our risk taxonomy based on the requirements. We have mapped critical functions, including all the definitions. I think adding the definition of what a critical function was very difficult because it can be interpreted in many ways, and you can create a very broad description and you need to align, and talking about fragmentation, you need to align the definition with all your risk departments on the difference from business continuity managed with the risk, first line risk, second line risk, and understand what does it mean a critical function and what is DORA saying in regards to that. So what is actually happening, or what I can see, is that the risk registers are updated, but the control owners doesn't know which controls are related to DORA and what is expected and how to test them, because we have created this new layer of controls. I think the criticality assessment, again, due to the definitions, are inconsistent because they're interpreted in different ways. And many firms still rely on Excel-based inventories, which is a problem because you don't know which one is the source of truth. And that one of the things also is we fail this in the continuous monitoring because, as you mentioned, it's done quarterly or annual and it's not in real time, which can also create some weaknesses around this area. The other component is the incident reporting, very good in paper, but when you are applying into it, there is more confusion in the practical side of it. We have incident classification models aligned to DORA, and we have made the 4 hours initial notification requirement. But what actually is happening is that we're still arguing internally about what is a major incident, which is one of the requirements in DORA, and you're defining, and I personally have been there, and we have been having major discussions on how do we classify a major incident and how we definition and where do we also how do we scope it, because you can create long definitions, but then you will have to cover bigger areas. I think SOC teams and compliance teams often don't share the same thresholds, and I think that's also problematic. Again, talking about fragmentation. Many firms cannot produce DORA compliant incident report between the 24 hours, which is required. And many companies' escalation paths are unclear, especially when we are outside the business hours. And sorry,
I think there is one I would like to highlight, Aarti, like, because most of our audience might be out of the EU. Many of them are in the Middle East. So I think you also mentioned that if their customers are in scope, they are in scope too. So could you please speak on that, like, for a few seconds, explain that to them, unpack that in a few seconds?
Yeah, I think that comes on the third-party risk part, which was the third point I wanted to touch, because that you are DORA, that financial institutions are regulated by DORA. That doesn't mean that if you are not a financial institution, you will not have DORA requirements. You can be indirectly regulated, because if you are providing services to a financial institution in Europe, they will set the requirements via the contract. So they will add some clauses that you will need to be DORA compliant, and that could be the right to audit. It could be also in terms of critical functions, information reports, and some of components of the due diligence process as well. They can add some additional questions because we need to include that. So most of the companies have completed the ICT third parties register, which is required. They have uploaded all the contracts, and they have created some addendums to the current contracts, because most companies has to do, but most of the inventories are incomplete, especially for shadow IT and fourth party, because you need to, if the provider is not providing back-to-back service, you need to understand the full value chain. So I mean, you can always outsource the activity, but not the responsibility will rely always on you.
Sounds great. I'll come to shadow AI and AI governance in a few seconds or minutes, but I'm mindful of time. We have only 15 minutes, and there is a lot of I think a lot of flying thoughts here. So I would highly appreciate if we can now, from now onwards, we can just try to keep the responses as concise as possible. I'll come to you, Aarti, in a few minutes, if you allow me to speak about shadow AI and AI governance, please. But speaking of supply chain and beyond, that's to Salih now. Beyond the tier 1 supply chain, BCM, what's the most consistent gap you find, and why does it stay hidden until something really breaks and becomes a headline? So Salih, in less than 2 minutes.
Yeah, okay. First of all, as a teacher, no, as an instructor, I have to explain maybe some of the attendees to what's tier 1. Tier 1 suppliers are companies directly work with, directly purchase from. These are the suppliers tier 1. But communication with them regularly is easy for the tier 1. But when your tier 1 supplier also depends on other suppliers, raw material providers, packaging companies, those type of things, those type of functions or suppliers they use. And many companies do not fully see these deeper layers of dependency. In other words, they know tier 1, but they don't see tier 2 or tier 3 or the invisible connections behind that operation, you know? So, and honestly, many crises start exactly there. Let me give you a retail example, because I work in a cosmetics company, retail company. Products arrive from supplier. Stores are full, sales are continuing, everybody feels comfortable, but suddenly packaging deliveries start slowing down. At first, people think, okay, maybe this is a temporary issue. But when you investigate deeper, you discover that the real problem is not the direct supplier at all. Maybe the raw material supplier stopped production. So supply chains are similar sometimes. I want to be shorten my speech. Sometimes I want to say sometimes management feels safe because they work with 3 different suppliers. Let me give you another example.
Short example,
So
very short.
exactly, yeah, exactly. For example, they say we distributed the risk. Because I see as an internal auditor, when I audit the procurement department, I saw those type of things. They say we distributed the risk. No problem. There's no problem here. But later they realize all 3 suppliers they distributed their purchases uses the same port, and some problem happens in that logistic company in the same port, so 3 suppliers goes away. Nobody sees that, you know. That's my example. That's the tier 2 that you should look for.
Thank you. I think third-party risk management is so critical, and many businesses collapse due to third-party risk. So people underestimate that. Speaking of risk, and back to Imran, risk metrics and heat maps are everywhere, and you are saying that they are no longer enough. What should senior risk and audit leaders be doing instead, and what does purpose or objective-focused risk management look like in practice? Within 2 minutes. I know it needs an hour at least.
I'll try to keep it crisp. No worries. So, as I was saying, executives don't think in colors. Why should risk managers? And I have not seen executives and boards making decisions based on colors. They assess a range of impacts on business objectives, assess the risk to the strategies, their alignment. So you can have a beautiful 5x5 matrix and still be completely blind to the thing that takes you down. So if every decision carries a risk, you know, why do we treat risk management as a separate exercise? So thinking about objective focused risk assessment, you know, it starts differently. You know, instead of asking what are our risks, you know, you start with what are we trying to accomplish and what needs to happen for us to reach there. It's not just, it's, you know, when you talk about risk, it's risk and reward both. In typical risk discussions, we only talk about the downside, not the upside. We only ask what could go wrong. We don't ask what needs to go right, you know. And I would say if a risk conversation doesn't end with someone knowing what to do differently, I would say it was an expensive exercise in documentation, you know. Ultimately, executives do not manage heat maps, they manage businesses. So risk management should help them make better decisions, not better reports. So if risk management makes them more informed, when they're making decisions, they are more confident and they feel they have assessed all the associated upside and downsides, risk management has done its job. And that's where the real risk management goes.
Thank you so much. Great perspective. And I think that takes us to Bushra. Bushra, AI. AI is embedded into decision-making everywhere. Regulators, boards, executives are all calling for stronger governance. In practice, what do organizations underestimate most when governing AI responsibly, and how does leadership close the gap? And then after that, Aarti will speak also about AI governance, shadow AI, and who owns that. Thank you.
So very quickly, I'll just try to keep it crisp, as Imran said. Now, we do see a lot of gaps where leadership often treats AI as an IT only system. They look at it as a system. We're trying to put data into it. It will do its algorithms, come back with us with a solution. But with decision making, in reality, always needs human interaction. It always needs the human input into whatever decision we need to make, especially when it comes to financials or the banking sector, where my background is from. We cannot always depend on numbers to take decisions. There are many other factors that are human made or human nature that needs to be there. AI will not always serve me right. I need to make sure that I do map and monitor the AI usage. When I provide AI to my employees or to my staff, especially the decision makers, I need to make sure that we provide them with the right acceptable use policies to do that. There is a lot of data that needs to be mapped, that needs to be masked, that needs to be encrypted, that I need to make sure that when I expose this information to the AI tools, that we are properly providing the use policies to the staff. The other thing is that we need to see is we need to make sure that we have a built governance and strong governance life cycle. My life cycle and my governance controls need to be on continuous basis. I cannot come and check on the tools every an annual basis or every other year. I need to make sure that not only am I monitoring and continuously monitoring the AI use, but there is an information that we really need to focus on is that we need to build this controls before the application is even introduced into to the organization or to the company. One more thing very quickly I'll highlight too. I've seen, I'm keeping my eyes on the comments on the LinkedIn site here. And I've seen that one of the questions is saying, do all companies have BCM? And the question would be definitely not. Not all of us have BCMs. Even if we do have it on papers, it is definitely not available or not regulated or required by every single organization to have that. We will need to look if this organization actually serves a lot of customers. What is the size? Are they willing to invest in BCM? BCM is a very, very, very costly tool or a costly process. To make sure it's not introducing or creating BCM into the business, it's actually making sure that we maintain it properly. That's where the cost actually comes from.
Thank you, Bushra. You have taken one question from the audience, which is great. You saved a few seconds to us. Sounds great. AI is not a technology job. You said also the data. AI is good as the data underneath it. So AI is not a technologist, just a technologist job. And AI governance is a layer of corporate governance. To you, Aarti. So whose job is AI governance in this?
Yeah, I think we were discussing a little bit what will be the scenario, the nightmare scenario for the CRO, and this is the slow. I think I've been thinking about that, and it will be the silent erosion of the control effectiveness. And I think some of the examples it would be if a credit model drifts and creates discriminatory outcomes, a regulator asks for evidences or oversight that doesn't exist, and actually is the CRO job to report this going forward. So there has to be some shift from is the model compliant to ask the question, is the operating model stable? Has AI changed it? So I think that's also we need to change a little bit the mindset. And I think the CRO needs to have a more proactive view in terms of addressing AI. And then in terms of ownership, in terms of the governance, I will suggest that the CRO owns this type of activity. And it's because AI is fundamentally a risk problem, not a technology problem in my view, because AI changes decision making, control efficiency, model stability, operational resilience, regulatory exposure, and customer, and that's covered by the risk taxonomy. So we are touching all the components. That's why a single owner will be very difficult to run and cover all the requirements that we have in terms of AI governance.
Thank you.
But
Thank you so much.
just want to have a quick add on what Aarti said. Totally agree with her. When it comes to AI governance, I think in the end, it's a business issue. It's if AI agents are making decisions on our behalf, we still own it. So the governance has to be embedded within the processes, and we should know that what data was processed, what process was applied to arrive at that decision. In the end, we own those decisions, and governance shouldn't come few months or weeks after the decision is made. It has to be embedded within the process. So that'll be my take on that.
Imran, this is spot on, and this is regulation in Europe. So the user for the first time is not just a passive consumer of technology. They are accountable for the use of that technology for the first time ever. So thank you so much. I would like to, now I think because the time is approaching, Simon, if you have one or two questions from the audience, we're happy to take those questions before we wrap up.
I would need to check.
If you are not ready,
I don't think we had time for questions. We were gonna, if there's all the comments that have been put into LinkedIn, we will respond to those after the session. But I think you probably had a final question for each of the members.
I do have really one. I would like in a rapid fire way. What is the one change that every one of you would like to see in the risk and assurance functions? So starting with you, Aarti.
I think it's the tone of the top, a sponsorship from the top management, understanding how all the functions operate and what we can bring in terms of decision making if we work less in silos.
Okay, thank you. Imran?
So Aarti said tone at the top. I would say it's tone at the top and also mood in the middle and buzz at the bottom. So risk assessment, the policy, the structure, and decision has to be integrated from top to bottom. And I would say stop scheduling risk assessment meetings and start scheduling decision reviews. That would make a huge difference.
Thank you. Salih?
I completely agree. I have nothing to add more. I mean, completely agree.
I don't believe
for
that.
my colleagues. No, Aarti and Imran said it all. I mean, yeah, I can talk hours about it, but attendees will think that I'm politician, not auditor. So
fantastic. Bushra?
So very quickly, in a nutshell, what I want to highlight here is that while we see businesses heavily invest in technology, data capturing, AI, they severely underinvest in the human-centric integration with those tools. We need to see more cross-department translations and more people working into cognitive silos. The first, second, and third line of defense really need to fill the gaps between them, and then reflect that on how they are supported by both the regulator who owns the policy or the entire policy of that and the frameworks, and then the third and fourth party, and how are they making sure that everything is covered and everything is working in cognitive silos rather than the individual silos we've seen today.
Sounds great. Thank you so much. I mean, what a session. This has been a great conversation, plenty of food for thoughts. What I can take from it, a few things, summarize a few points here. The gap isn't capability. The gap is connection. The connective tissue between the risk and assurance function, the data, the signals, the shared picture that would let all functions be one, work as one. The orchestration. I believe orchestration here is the answer, how we move dynamically as one. Not a new governance model, not another committee. It's a combination of that mindset and architectural change. So the audit, risk, continuity, security, and the governance finally share data, share signals, and operate as one system. The organization that closed the gap won't do it by adding another framework. They will do it by changing the underlying infrastructure and ways of working. So the 5 functions finally operate as one system. So thank you so much, Salih, Bushra, Imran, and Aarti. You have given the audience something really to act on today. And to everyone who joined us, thank you. Big thank you. And over to you, Simon, to conclude the session. And I would love to see all of you again next month in another session.
Yeah,
Inshallah.
I'd just like to add my thanks, obviously, to all of you. I've certainly learned a lot from your experience in this discussion, which is great, and hopefully the attendees have found it helpful and they've had some useful takeaways as well. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, the attendees. We will be having a follow-up session. This is part of a program that SustainGRC put on, talking about really critical subjects that are relevant today. If you want to have a look at how we at SustainGRC help our customers manage this dynamic, we will be having a follow-up session. So keep a lookout for the invitation and please go ahead and register. But just thank you again for everyone that's attended.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.